get started, welcome to the 2018 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. The title of the series this year is The Rivers Will Run, a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So over the course of the next 8 weeks, we are going to be focusing on speakers who have a connection to rivers that may be protected under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. They may not be protected but seeking protection, or they may be special waterways that people are connected to in some way, shape, or form and hope that they may one day find those protections. We're going to look at the legacy of the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act over the last 50 years, from its roots here in Montana to its breadth nationally as well as internationally. All right, so tonight I get to introduce our first speaker in the lecture series, Charles Ray. Charles Ray first saw the Salmon River when he moved to Idaho in 1976. He is a graduate of the University of Tennessee School of Forestry, and he earned his living as a timber faller, an industrial electrician, and working on salmon and steelhead recovery. He fills his time now with reading, bird watching, camping, cutting firewood, skiing, and sampling salmon and steelhead populations on the Salmon River. I've been doing this introduction spiel for 7 years, and that is by far the best list people have sent me about what they do to fill their time. When I read it, I was like, that sounds so amazing. I'm going to do that to fill my time. Charles also works periodically on field work for a geologic mapping project in Hell's Canyon of the Snake River. He lives with his wife Leslie now in McCall, Idaho, near the Salmon River. So tonight he's going to be talking to us about the natural history, the geologic history, and the special attributes of the Salmon River in 4 parts. So let's welcome Charles to our lecture series.
All right, thank you very much. Can everybody hear okay in the back? Everybody okay? Is it too loud? Okay. I appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to a good evening. I'm not going to fill up this entire time slot because I want to leave some time for discussion and questions. So when I get through, it's up to you guys. You've got the floor. Okay, the Nez Perce Indians called it Natso-Kus, Chinook salmon water. The Shoshone-Bannock Indians called it Agai Mpa'a, which means big fish water. William Clark in 1805 called it Lewis's Fork of the Columbia River in honor of Meriwether Lewis. But that name didn't last long, and today we call it the Salmon River, the river of no return. It's a river of superlatives, and I'll go down the list. It's the longest river within a single state in the lower 48. It's over 400 miles long from its source downstream of Stanley, Idaho, all the way to the confluence with the Snake River in Hell's Canyon. It flows through the largest wilderness area in the lower 48. The combined Frank Church River of No Return wilderness area and the Gospel Hump wilderness area comprising 5,000 miles. Depending on your definition of a dam, it could be said to be the longest undammed river in the lower 48. It's a home of sockeye salmon. The fish, the southernmost population of sockeye salmon on this planet, the fish that climb to the highest elevation from sea level to over 7,000 feet. It's the largest tributary in the entire Snake River system in terms of square miles, over 14,000 square miles. It's the second largest tributary of the Snake in terms of discharge. The annual discharge of the Salmon River into the Snake is over 9 million acre feet, a lot of water. In terms of superlatives, this river is hugely diverse. It's superlatively diverse. It has diverse geography, geology, fauna, flora, fish, and history. So I'm going to describe each of those attributes of the river. And then I'm going to try to tie it all together with the outstandingly remarkable values that are preserved in a couple sections of this river by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So I'm going to start out, if this works, right here on this little section of the river right here. This is the headwater section from its source here to Stanley, Idaho. That's in a geographic area known as the Stanley Basin. It's a north-south valley. It's bounded by geological faults on both sides. On the west side of the valley is the Sawtooth Mountain Range. On the east side are the Boulder White Clouds. The valley floor there is about 7,100 feet in elevation. And the river through the valley floor is a low gradient, gentle, narrow, meandering river. This river is fed by 4 tributary streams right here in the very south end of the Sawtooth Valley, or the Stanley Basin. It goes by both names. It's also fed from the west side by 5 high mountain lakes. These are glacial alpine lakes, and these 5 lakes were the home of the sockeye salmon. Now only one of these lakes has sockeye. In terms of geology, this is called a fault block basin or a fault block valley. It's actually one of the northernmost extensions of the Basin and Range physiographic province that starts down in Utah. There's a couple more of these northern extensions on downstream, which we'll talk about in just a little while. The geology over here on the west side of the Stanley Basin is mostly granite. It's two large granitic plutons, big intrusions of granite. Terms of age, they're in Cretaceous, 100 million to 65 million. Throughout my talk here, I'm going to mention some geological ages. And I might use the name of the period or epoch, and I might use the years. But, you know, I find it hard to believe, at least for myself. I can't get my head wrapped around 100 million years. It's hard to think about even 1 million years. So in terms of geologic time, even the youngest rocks are really, really old. So I'll mention the time period, but I like to keep the geology relative in young, pretty old, and really old. So geologically, these are pretty young mountains, and this is a pretty young geological province right here. The glaciers that fill the valleys in these mountains 10 to 30,000 years ago filled this valley floor with several thousand feet of glacial sediment. The mountains on both sides, the Boulder White Clouds on the east, the Sawtooths on the west, all of these mountains are heavily faulted. They have a lot of geothermal activities, a lot of hot springs there, as will be the case for the entire length of the river. And there's a lot of hydrothermal mineralization, a lot of minerals there, a lot of metals that are deposited by the hydrothermal activity. What you'll see in terms of geology is the gross geology, and that's what I'm going to describe, only the gross geology, what you see when you drive through there. I'll also describe the fauna and flora in gross terms, what you're likely to see when you drive through, and not getting down and crawling through the brush and looking. So in this Sawtooth Basin right here, this 22-mile section of river, You'll see Rocky Mountain goats, bighorn sheep, a lot of pronghorns in there. You're likely to see wolverine, gray wolf, maybe lynx, quite a few domestic cattle, and sometimes you'll see domestic sheep there. In terms of flora, on the valley floor, on the Sawtooth Basin floor, you'll see bunch grass, sagebrush, a few cottonwood trees. In the mountains around, the predominant forest cover type is lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, Engelmann spruce, and subalpine fir. The fish you'll find there, again, these are the big guys. These are the ones you'll see when you walk up and down the river, are bull trout, cutthroat trout, spring and summer Chinook salmon, sockeye salmon. There's also a fish hatchery located right here in the Sawtooth Basin. It's a hatchery that was put there in 1985, raises Chinook salmon in an attempt to compensate for mortality in wild salmon runs caused mostly by downstream dams. In recent years, this Stanley Fish Hatchery has turned into a sockeye salmon captive rearing hatchery, where a remnant museum piece population of these fish that once numbered in the thousands today has been reduced to a remnant museum piece population that's kept alive by extraordinary means at the cost of tens of millions of dollars annually. What was once the world's southernmost large run of sockeye salmon has now been reduced to just a few hatchery fish. This is Shoshone and Bannock Indian country. They occupied this valley in the summer months for thousands and thousands of years. Okay, river miles from the source right here to the mouth of the salmon up here at the Snake. It's over 400 miles. And I'm going to give you some river mileages, but it's not really important. Anyway, this is the first 22 miles of the river. River mile 400 to river mile 378. The next section, I'm not going to do this 22 miles at a time either, I promise you. The next section is 141 miles. It's river mile 378 to river mile 237. And it is from the Sawtooth Basin right here to North Fork, Idaho. It's only 120 miles from Missoula. It's across Lost Trail Pass. From the Stanley Basin to North Fork, the river runs generally east and north. It's a higher gradient. It's steeper, goes through an incised canyon. From Stanley, Idaho to North Fork, the river drops approximately 3,500 feet. The path of the river is also fault controlled. It follows faults in the bedrock geology. Along the way, it picks up three major tributaries that run generally southeast to northwest. It would be the East Fork of the Salmon, the Pomeroy, and the Lemhi River. Three major tributaries here. All three of these tributaries are also located in fault block valleys that are also northern extensions of the physiographic province, the Basin and Range, that we most typically see down in Utah and Nevada. The geology here, again, is granite from the Idaho batholith, but also downstream of Challis, Idaho, we start picking up some volcanic rocks that are called the Challis volcanics. They're relatively young compared to the batholith granites. These are 55 to 33 million years old. We also find isolated outcrops of very, very, very old rocks from the Proterozoic. It's schist and gneiss. These are over 1 billion years old. Also along the way, especially as we get close to Salmon, Idaho, we find sedimentary rocks that are also Proterozoic or Precambrian, very old. They're similar to to the belt supergroup of rocks that we see right around Missoula here. All of these valleys, East Fork Valley, Pomeroy Valley, and Lemhi Valley, these are all filled with several thousand feet of glacially derived sand and gravel, glacial sediments. The river here, as I said, follows a fault path. The underlying bedrock's heavily faulted. Lots of hot springs. There's lots of hydrothermal mineralization. There has been and continues to be a lot of exploitation of these mineral deposits. Right about here is a huge molybdenum mine that's gone through many decades of boom and bust. It happens to be in a bust right now, but it's called the Thompson Creek Mine. And I'll come back to it in just a little while. There's a lot to say about the Thompson Creek Mine. In terms of fauna, you'll see the same big animals that you saw in the Sawtooth Basin. You'll see elk, mule deer, bighorn sheep, Rocky Mountain goats, a few pronghorn, a lot of wolves, an occasional wolverine, maybe a lynx, bobcat, cougar, and you'll also, especially in the East Fork Valley, the Pomeroy Valley, and the Lemhi Valley, you'll see a lot of domestic cows, a whole lot of them. In this section of the river, as the elevation decreases, we begin to pick up ponderosa pines. There's some Rocky Mountain junipers there, cottonwood, a lovely and fascinating little tree called mountain mahogany. There's sagebrush, bunch grass, a whole bunch of irrigated agriculture. It's mainly for forage crops, hay, alfalfa. In this higher gradient section of the river, we start seeing steelhead. It's another anadromous fish. It's another salmon. And we also run into fish hatcheries again on the Pomeroy and the East Fork. These are steelhead and the salmon, and they dump millions and millions and millions of hatchery fish into the river every year to the disadvantage, the wholly disadvantage of wild fish. The hatchery program for salmon and steelhead and wild fish don't go together, and the wild fish always lose. That's because of some genetic aberrations that occur. Epigenetic changes occur in hatchery fish. Hatchery fish outcompete wild fish for scarce resources in these high headwater streams. Hatchery fish have undergone an unnatural selection process, whereas the ones that survive are particularly suited to the hatchery environment instead of the wild environment. They have some measure of resistance to hatchery-borne diseases, which they then infect wild fish with when they're released to the wild. So I'll get back to the hatchery fish in a little while, but the thing to remember is that the hatchery influence is strong and pervasive and consistent all the way down the river channel. About 20 miles south of Salmon, Idaho, in the late 1930s, a man arrived there named Richard Zimmerman. And he came as a miner, and he liked it, and he decided to stay, and he had nowhere to stay. So about 20 miles south of the town of Salmon, on river left, as you're facing downriver, on river left, Richard Zimmerman put to work his skills as a miner, and he dug out and constructed a whole little community of dugout dwellings where he stayed the rest of his life. And he raised a small herd of goats, and he made yogurt from the goat milk, and that's about all he ever ate was goat milk yogurt. When I met Richard Zimmerman, he was an old man, and he wasn't called Richard anymore because of the way he lived. he was called Dugout Dick. So when I met Dugout Dick, he was an old man, and he still had his miner's hard hat on. He was quite a character. He died in 1985. Okay. This is Shoshone and Bannock country right here. Also, a band of Shoshone called the Lemhi Shoshone lived right in here. These are the folks that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark ran into in 1805 when they came across Lemhi Pass into the Lemhi River Valley. Meriwether Lewis stayed right there in the valley for several days while William Clark went downstream on the Lemhi and then downstream on the Salmon River from North Fork right here on down to kind of do a little reconnaissance trip there. And he came back and he didn't have a very good report. He recommended not trying to go down the Salmon River in canoes and instead to try to acquire some horses from these Lemhi Shoshone Indians, which they did, and went back across the hill into the Bitterroot Valley right here. So that was the last time Lewis and Clark laid eyes on the Salmon River drainage that anybody knows. The conventional wisdom is that Lewis and Clark were the first white people, the first Europeans to lay eyes on the Salmon River either. I don't know about that, but the area is rich in history of the Lewis and Clark expedition. There's also another little piece of history that occurred right about here, just upstream from Challis, Idaho. In 1910, a mining company that was placer mining gold on the Yankee Fork of the Salmon, which runs in from the north into the Salmon, ended up decimating that entire valley. It's nuked, it's bombed out now. But they needed electricity to run their mining operation. In 1910, they built a dam on the Salmon River. And it was a pretty good sized dam too. It was about 40 feet high. Had a rudimentary fish ladder. It had a fairly efficient and fairly large hydroelectric generator on there. Well, by the 1930s, the mines had gone bust and the miners had all left and the dam was still in the river. And it mostly blocked the migration of summer Chinook salmon, steelhead, and sockeye up here to the Sawtooth Valley. So in 1935, in what was the very first Environmental Restoration Act that I know of that occurred in the state of Idaho and perhaps in the West, the locals who didn't like the fact that the dam had blocked off the salmon runs and the miners had walked off and left it, dynamited that dam and restored the free-flowing character of the river, and they restored the sockeye and Chinook salmon to the upper Stanley Basin there. It's called Sunbeam Dam, still there today. If you float that section of the river in a raft or a kayak, you go right through the hole they blasted in the dam. It's pretty cool. Okay, the third section from right here, North Fork, Idaho to about right there. Everybody see that? North Fork right here. I'm not sure. Can you guys see this red thing?
I don't think it's working.
Oh, okay.
It is, it's real dull.
North Fork, Idaho to Long Tom Bar. Okay? This is the section of the river that flows through the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness Area. The section is 124 miles long. It's from River Mile 237 to River Mile 113. And in that 124 miles, the river drops 1,600 feet. In terms of geography, the canyon is steep. It's deeply incised. The river has a higher gradient. Right here at North Fork, as is obvious, the river turns abruptly west, again following fault lines, it is believed. It zigzags north and south across central Idaho, through the middle of the Idaho batholith, this huge intrusive granite mountain. In fact, when this thing intruded into the crust, the upper part of the crust, it was a solid mass of granite. As the overburden has eroded away and the river has down cut through it, it's become fairly heavily faulted. It is also mineralized by hydrothermal mineralization. It's truly, it's an outstanding and stunning sight, this monstrous slab of granite that goes on unbroken for miles and miles and miles and miles. This is also where the current section of the river that's protected by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is located. Part of this is wild, is designated wild, part of it's designated recreational, and I'll come back to that in just a little while. Starting out on the upstream end of this section, just downstream from the town of North Fork, Idaho, we find some of the oldest known rocks in the state of Idaho, 1.3 billion years old. The nature of the rock is schist, gneiss, and quartzite. Again, there's a lot of placer gold on this section of the river. It's been heavily placer mined through the years. And on this tributary right here, Panther Creek, again coming in from the south, there's been a large deposit of cobalt located there. It's been mined off and on for years and years. The drainage from the Panther Creek cobalt mine has thoroughly poisoned Panther Creek. It's been an EPA Superfund site in an attempt to sort of clean it up and mitigate the damage there. There's currently a proposal to reopen that cobalt mine. It's known as the Blackbird Mine. Fauna you'll see when you float or backpack that section of the river, no roads there. It's all on foot or on the water. You'll see bighorn, moose, mountain goats again, elk, mule deer, plenty of wolves, wolverine, bobcat, cougar, and all the small game that goes along with that, the small animals. The predominant forest cover type is ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, some cottonwood, alders, mountain mahogany, and in this section you'll start seeing a pretty neat little tree. It's called western hackberry. You'll see a lot of them down through there. They start appearing right there. This is spring and summer Chinook, salmon country, steelhead again, bull trout, cutthroat trout, and in this section you'll start seeing sturgeon. White sturgeon, Asapenser transmontanus. These are the big guys now. This is the biggest freshwater fish in North America. This section of the river, they get up to 7 feet long, up to about 220 pounds in weight. They live up to 100 years. They're ancient fish, they're cartilaginous fish, like a shark. They don't have a bony skeleton. But even in the absence of a bony skeleton, the fossil record shows us that white sturgeon have been around for at least 160 million years. These are ancient fish. There's not very many of them, but they're there, and they thrive in free-flowing, clean water, and they're hanging on right there. It's pretty amazing on a river half as wide as this room with not much flow to encounter a fish 7 feet long, but they're there. They're pretty cool. In the lower section down here, we begin to encounter smallmouth bass, which are an exotic invasive species. They come from the Great Lakes area. They've been there quite a while, and they're fairly ubiquitous in there. As one floats or walks down this river, at a place called Campbell's Ferry, it's an old ferry crossing. There's currently a pack bridge across the river right now. On river left, you'll find a couple houses, you'll find an orchard, pretty good orchard too. The remains of a vegetable garden, and several graves there. This was the house of a woman who came to the Salmon River country again in the 30s. When she arrived at the Salmon River, her name was Lydia Coyle. Everybody knows her as Free Press Frances Zonmiller, but her name was really Lydia Coyle. She lived down there for the rest of her life. She died in late 1980s. She outlived 3 husbands down there. She lived mostly by herself. She was tough as nails. She wrote a semi-regular column for the Idaho County Free Press newspaper, and she would give the drafts of her column to people floating the river or to horse packers, and sooner or later they would get to Grangeville, Idaho, and they would show up in the Idaho County Free Press. She did that for decades. Free Press Frances Zonmiller. Little ways down the river, again on River Left at Painter Bar, just a few miles upstream of where the South Fork of the Salmon comes in. Again in the 1930s, a man from Oklahoma named Sylvan Ambrose Hart showed up there. He left Oklahoma as a young man in his 20s with a degree in English literature from the University of Oklahoma and a good start on a master's degree in mechanical engineering. And somehow he ended up in central Idaho on the Salmon River, and he remained there for the rest of his life. Hardly anybody knows him as Sylvan Ambrose Hart, but a lot of people knew him as Buckskin Bill Hart, the last of the mountain men. He had quite a little establishment there on Painter Bar. Had a magnificent vegetable garden. He had quite a few buildings that he had built, and he truly was and lived as a mountain man. He was an excellent gunsmith. He made exquisite, superb muzzle-loading rifles and pistols. He made all his own tools. He made knives. Buckskin Bill died in 1980, and he's buried right there on Painter Bar. So, just a little downstream of Buckskin Bill's place at Painter Bar, again on River Left, tributary stream called Polly's Creek runs in. Okay, so we have to step back a little bit before Buckskin Bill's time and before Free Press Frances's time. We're going to step back to about 1855 in Mandarin, China. And a little girl there was born named Leilu Nehoy. And for unknown but undoubtedly unfortunate circumstances, Leilu Nehoy's parents sold her into indentured servitude, and she was brought to Portland, Oregon. And there she was indentured to a Chinese man named Hong King for the amount of $2,500. In 1874, Leilu Nehoy arrived in Warren, Idaho, on a tributary stream there. Warren, at that time, 1874, was a gold boom town. And the man who she was indentured to, Hong King, he owned a saloon and a boarding house there in the boom mining town of Warren, Idaho. And in Warren, Leilu Nehoy became Polly and was always known as Polly. About 20 years after she arrived there, under some circumstance, maybe the repayment of a gambling debt, a man named Charlie Bemis bought her out of her indentured servitude. And he was also a saloon keeper, and Polly ran his saloon for him. Shortly after Charlie Bemis relieved Polly of her indentured servitude, he was shot in a dispute over a card game, and Polly nursed him back to health, and he married her. life was pretty tough there up in Warren for the Chinese folks then, so they moved north and down to the Salmon River, and Charlie Bemis died in 1920, and Polly lived down there for about another 15 or 18 years by herself on a great little homestead. Her house is still there. A lot of Polly Bemis's stuff, the furnishings from her house and her personal belongings they're in a museum in Cottonwood, Idaho, that's run by some Catholic sisters that live there in Cottonwood. Anyway, Polly Bemis, and the creek is named after Polly's Creek. She's buried now in Grangeville, Idaho. Pretty interesting character. She was tough as nails. She was less than 5 feet tall, weighed less than 100 pounds. She's tougher than any man down there. This is also Shoshone-Bannock country. However, on the downstream end, we start encountering Nez Perce Indian country. Also on the middle part of the middle fork of the Salmon, group of Indians unusually live there year-round, not like the rest of the Indians that migrated in and out according to the season. These Indians were maybe a subgroup of Shoshone, but they were called the sheep eaters. Tukadika is their name for themselves, Tukadika. In 1935, National Geographic Society had heard about the Salmon River, and they organized a float trip, and they floated from North Fork, Idaho to Riggins, Idaho. And it's written up in National Geographic magazine. I've seen it. It's a great story. It's very good. Also in 1935, the first upstream trip came, and it was done in a powerboat with a small outboard motor. So for the first 130 years that European folks had been in that country, it truly was the river of no return. When you floated down, you didn't come back. At least on the river, you didn't come back. You might walk back. But that came to an end the same year the National Geographic folks floated down, 1935. Okay. Long Tom Bar, about right here, to the confluence of the Salmon and the Snake in Hell's Canyon of the Snake. This is River Mile 113 to River Mile 0. Long Tom Bar to the Snake River. The Salmon River loses over 700 feet there. At the confluence of the Snake, the elevation is 950 feet. From Long Tom Bar, the river runs, as you see, due west, 26 miles to Riggins, Idaho, takes a hard right into another geological fault path. Goes due north 34 miles to right near Whitebird, Idaho, and then it begins a big 180, a big button hook for the last 53 miles into the Snake River. The terrain down there is generally more open. The river follows a more gentle gradient. It's joined right at Riggins by the last major tributary, the Little Salmon River. In the Button Hook section, from Whitebird to the confluence with the Snake, even though the overall canyon is more spread out and open, there's 4 gorges in there, and they're all 4 geologically different. They're different in appearance. The rapids are even different, and they're stunning canyons. It's Blue Canyon, Green Canyon, Snowhole Canyon, and Cougar Canyon. They're just remarkably different in that section of the river. For the first, the geology really gets good in this section, so I'm going to spend just a slight bit more time there. For the first few miles downstream of Long Tom Bar, it's the same Idaho batholith geology that we've gone through for the previous 120 some miles upstream. There's also a little bit of gneiss, and this thing still working? Did it quit? Well, don't know about that. Okay, I'll try to talk a little louder.
Everybody hear him okay? All right.
Okay.
Spare batteries, but I think you're good.
All right. About 20 miles upstream of Riggins, Idaho, the geology undergoes a dramatic and marked change, and it happens just like that. And we go from the Idaho batholith, which is intrusive granite formed in place, to a whole different suite of rocks that are all put together in what's known as an accreted terrain. These rocks on this side, on the west side of what's known as the Idaho Suture Zone, these rocks formed during the Permian and Triassic geological time periods, which is roughly 250 to 200 million years ago. They're mostly volcanics. They formed in an offshore island arc, very, very similar to the Aleutian Islands that we'll see today. That offshore island arc was located on a tectonic plate called the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate that subducted under the North American plate. North American plate, all of this moving northwest. The Juan de Fuca plate was moving almost straight east. They collided. Juan de Fuca plate plunged underneath the North American plate, and it's still going on today. As the Juan de Fuca plate moved east, about 130 million years ago, this offshore island arc, these volcanic islands, encountered and were plastered on to the North American continent. And the suture zone where that happened, where those offshore islands hit the North American continent, the Idaho Suture Zone is right there. You can drive right through it. It's only about 10 miles wide. It's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. So the geology west of there is entirely different than what you've gone through in the east. It's a collision of tectonic plates, the Juan de Fuca plate and the North American plate. That collision happened roughly 130 million years ago. What's happened since then, we really don't know, because all of that geology was erased by erosion until around 14 million years ago, when a volcanic eruptive center in what's now eastern Washington and eastern Oregon flooded this entire area from Riggins, Idaho west, flooded it with what's called flow basalt. It's another igneous rock. Those basalt deposits down there are 1,000 to 6,000 feet deep. They flooded all the canyons, flooded all the valleys. It actually looks like layer cakes down there now. So we have flood basalts coming in 14 million years ago. We have the offshore island arc arriving 130 million years ago, and everything in between has been erased. We don't know about it. The flood basalts are just stunning. They are absolutely stunning. They're like a layer cake. You can see it up and down the hills and canyons. Some of them have a slight tilt to them because of uplift, but that's the big geological characteristic of the area. Columbia River flood basalts, okay? Hydrothermal mineralization continues down through there. There's a whole lot of historic mining activity that's going on. There's current commercial placer mining going on right now south of Riggins, Idaho. some up by Whitebird also. The lower gorge, the lower 54 miles from Whitebird downstream, is characterized by the most beautiful, extensive white sand beaches you can imagine. They're replenished by the spring runoff every year, and they are just stunning. There's a campsite around every corner, and they're all on the most beautiful white sand beaches. Again, a lot of placer gold down there. That area in the late 1800s and early 1900s was mined extensively by Chinese miners, Chinese placer miners. And their dwellings and their mine workings are still visible today. There's quite a bit of cultural history down there. In that section of the river, we begin seeing white-tailed deer. That's another invasive exotic species that showed up down there, and there's a lot of them there. We also see bighorn sheep down there pretty often where they have not encountered domestic sheep. When the domestic sheep are down there, the bighorns aren't, because domestic sheep transmit a fatal disease to bighorns. So the bighorns suffer down there, but in areas that are too rough for the domestic sheep, or where the sheep grazing allotments have been retired, bighorns are fairly common down there. In terms of flora, there's more grassy slopes. It's less timbered. The section immediately upstream through the Frank Church is almost entirely timbered. On this lower gorge section, there's more grassy slopes. It's drier. You have bunch grass again, sagebrush. You begin to see prickly pear, cactus, hackberries show up. But on the north-facing slopes down there, there's still ponderosa and Douglas fir. Spring and summer chinook, steelhead, sturgeon, bass, suckers, mountain whitefish, some trout down there, but this water's warmer down there, so the smallmouth bass flourish in the warmer water. More hatcheries on this tributary right here of the Little Salmon. There's a spring chinook hatchery. It's run by Idaho Power Corporation. It's supposed to mitigate for the damage done to the fish run by 3 dams over in Hell's Canyon on the Snake River. So we have these interbasin transfers of fish going on now. Also on the South Fork of the Salmon, there's a fish trap there, catches summer chinook salmon. They take them to my hometown in McCall, rear them by the millions, take them back down and dump them in the river. That's a Lower Snake River Compensation Plan hatchery. Came in the mid-'80s. It's funded by the Bonneville Power Administration, who markets electricity from 8 downstream dams on the Snake River and the Columbia River. Those 8 dams are the critical limiting factor to the survival of Salmon River salmon and steelhead. Those dams were built between 1938 and 1976. They weren't designed, nor are they operated today to safely pass juvenile fish going downstream. So nearly all of the wild juvenile fish that encounter those 8 dams don't make it. Also, most of the hatchery fish don't either. But since the system is now flooded with hatchery fish, the hatchery returns are higher, far, far higher than the wild returns. Idaho's salmon and steelhead are all listed under the Endangered Species Act, beginning in 1992 with sockeye salmon as being the first fish listed. Since their listing, wild fish numbers have not recovered. They're still the same. They're virtually the same. They're up and down every year. It's a tragedy in the making. Okay. This is mostly Nez Perce Indian country. At Whitebird, Idaho, just upstream, in 1877, was the first engagement of what's known today as the Nez Perce Indian War, where some Nez Perce Indians, after being run out of Oregon, they were on their way to Canada through Montana here, and they were intercepted by a U.S. Army cavalry contingent from Mount Idaho Garrison a few miles north. And in a canyon right there at Whitebird, Idaho, the U.S. Army cavalry contingent was ambushed by these Nez Perce Indians, and they came out pretty poorly. The cavalry did. They call that the Nez Perce. They call it a massacre, the Whitebird Massacre. So when the Indians win, it's a massacre, and when the U.S. Army won, it was a battle. But this one's called a massacre. Anyway, that's traditional Nez Perce Indian country. They still use that country. Part of their reservation before it was shrunk down in the late 1800s encompassed that Horseshoe Bend, that button hook of the river. Just downstream from Whitebird, not too many miles, at a place called Pine Bar, there was a historic ferry there called Cooper's Ferry, but at the location of Cooper's Ferry is the oldest known archaeological site on the Salmon River, and one of the oldest in the state of Idaho. It's called Cooper's Ferry Occupation Site. It has firm dates of over 11,000 years, and it has several thousand years of continuous occupation documented there. It's Cooper's Ferry site. It's still under excavation down there. It's been excavated for about 10 years now. Okay, that's the description of the environment. I want to spend a few minutes on the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. In the early 1960s, a visionary Idaho senator named Frank Church, with the help of two biologists from Wyoming named Frank and John Craighead, decided that this river system in particular, and river systems in general, should be afforded some sort of protection. So with the help of Frank and John Craighead, Senator Church came up with some language, an act of Congress that protected rivers. Now I have to read this, I can't memorize this. Senator Church said that these protected rivers possess outstandingly remarkable scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife, cultural, or similar values in their free-flowing condition. And it should be assured that they and their immediate environments shall be protected for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. And that language that I believe the Craigheads came up with. Anyway, that language forms the heart of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which Senator Church introduced in Congress. It was introduced in 1967. This act protecting unnamed rivers nationwide in their free-flowing state and preserving the outstandingly remarkable values. This piece of legislation passed the U.S. Congress and became law in 1968 with only 7 dissenting votes in the entire Congress. It's pretty hard for me to imagine this, but it happened in 68. In 1980, two sections only of the Salmon River, plus the entire length of the Middle Fork. In 1980, those sections were added to the list of wild and scenic rivers protected by the Act. They were promoted and added to the protected rivers list, again, by Senator Frank Church and Governor Cecil Andrus, who had just come off a term as Secretary of Interior, so he was pretty influential. So the upper 46 miles that's protected is from North Fork, Idaho to Corn Creek, Idaho. It's 46 miles. The designation right there is recreational. The next 78 miles from Corn Creek down to Long Tom Bar is the section that goes through the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness, and it's designated as wild. This wild and scenic river section, 124 miles, it's managed by 4 national forests and 3 BLM districts, and they are charged by federal law to preserve the values, to preserve the outstandingly remarkable values that allowed these rivers to be added to the list. In 1992, Idaho Congressman Larry LaRocco introduced a bill to add 3 more sections of the Salmon River, a total of 112 miles, from Long Tom Bar, right about here, all the way down to the Snake. He didn't go anywhere in 92, he did it again in 94, and it wasn't passed then. Today, with the current state of the United States Congress, and particularly with the current state of the Idaho legislature, I can't imagine another single mile being added in Idaho. I might be wrong, but I can't visualize it happening. At the same time, the 124 miles that we do have protected on the Middle Salmon were added to the act in 1980. A reconnaissance was done on the upper 167 miles, right here, and all of that was deemed eligible for inclusion under wild and scenic protection. But it hasn't happened. That was eligible as a recreational river. So we have this river that's over 400 miles long from source to mouth, and we have one 124-mile section in the middle protected by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Nationwide, there's been a little more success than what we see in Idaho. Today, at 12,734 miles of free-flowing river, of 208 rivers, 12,734 miles of 208 rivers are protected by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. That's 1/4 of 1% of all the river miles in the lower 48, 1/4 of 1%. On the other hand, we have 600,000 miles in the lower 48 of rivers dammed, which make up 17% of the total river miles in the lower 48. With management by 4 national forests, 3 BLM districts, the Wilderness Act, and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which only protects a 1/4-mile corridor on each side of the river, there's a whole bunch of management challenges. The agencies in charge of maintaining, preserving, and protecting the outstandingly remarkable values of this river are beset by huge challenges. The first challenge that I see is that management is not of the entire river. It's only section by section. There's no comprehensive river-wide management plan. There's no complete vision. There's often conflicting objectives, and there's fragmented management. This resource is not managed on a drainage-wide basis. It's not managed on a tributary-wide basis. It's managed in a very fragmented, often conflicting manner, section by section by section. The second management challenge that I see is an institutional situation within the federal agencies charged with managing this river, and it's no management continuity. Line officers in these organizations are not quite here today, gone tomorrow, but they serve generally very limited tenure in each position within the BLM district or within the particular national forest, and then they move on. It's almost like a revolving door of senior administrators and managers, and that, through no fault of these folks, most of these folks are very dedicated, very smart professionals, but they operate under this institutional system which leaves them with no sense of ownership of the resource and no sense of place. That's very important for somebody charged with maintaining the outstandingly remarkable values, a sense of place and a sense of ownership. Another management challenge is the increasing numbers of users and the competing demands. This section of the river right here, through the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness Area, got 7,000 river floaters last year. It's lottery controlled, which is a good thing. And the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act has made a big difference down there. It's made a big difference. The beaches are cleaner, the campsites are cleaner, the lottery system kind of rations the use down there, and it's generally a good deal. But there's plenty of competing demands, and there's tremendous pressure to increase the use down there. Going right along with that is decreasing management agency budgets for non-commodity values. Recreation is generally a non-commodity value. Outstandingly remarkable scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife, and cultural values that these agencies are charged with protecting are non-commodity values. And there's incredible pressure on these managing agencies to commodify the river. The terminology often used is to run this agency like a business. Well, these aren't businesses. These agencies are public agencies that manage public resources, and the people that run them have a public trust responsibility, not to run the agency like a business, but to protect the values of the river. Lots of threats in addition to the management challenges. In the long term, climate change is the huge threat. It threatens loss of species diversity. It threatens increasingly large, increasingly severe fires. It threatens loss of resiliency within the ecosystems. It threatens greatly reduced flows in the river. Climate change, that's the big one. In the immediate term, the threats I see are continued commodification of public resources. Again, these are not businesses, these are public resources. There's tremendous demands on water rights, which makes this central wild and scenic section particularly vulnerable. All of these water rights up through here determine the flow. The water uses in this section and in all these tribs determine the flow. Under Idaho water law, an in-stream flow is not a beneficial use. So these rivers are all over appropriated. There's been more water rights granted than there's water in the river. The upstream impacts on the wild and scenic section are pollution and low flow. And because we have this fragmented management, we don't have a river-wide approach, this is an immediate and an increasing threat. The loss of salmon and steelhead is a huge threat. We've already lost tremendous amount of genetic diversity and resilience within these fish populations, primarily because of the effect of downstream dams on the Snake and Columbia River and the hatchery program within Idaho. Salmon River, the entire drainage is threatened by large-scale mining, which I mentioned earlier, Thompson Creek mine right here, boom and bust mine, currently in a bust cycle. It's a molybdenum mine. Has a tailings dam made out of dirt and rock that's over 700 feet high that impounds millions of cubic yards of toxic mine waste in a very high gradient drainage immediately upstream from the Salmon River. Right here near between Stanley and Chalice, again on the Yankee Fork, the abandoned Grouse Creek mine, same situation. It's a potential Superfund site, requires perpetual water treatment. It constantly leaches toxic material into the Salmon River drainage. Currently proposed up the South Fork of the Salmon is a huge open pit gold mine called, believe it or not, the Midas Gold Mine. 3 open pits, one entirely in the river channel, estimated 20-year life of the mine. Big management conflict up there within the Forest Service and between the public and these miners. The last threat that I see is nationwide, potentially affects everything, definitely affects this, and that's the dismantling of the federal agencies that are charged with protecting these outstandingly remarkable values, and the low likelihood of ever rebuilding those agencies while the U.S. Congress is beholden to corporations and large political action committee donors. We have a good example right now within the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior. Those 2 federal agencies in charge with managing these river systems, in charge with upholding the public trust, are being run by people who have zero experience. They're being headed by people that have zero experience in natural resource management. I fear that as these agencies are dismantled, we'll never make up the loss. For 130 years, this river was called the River of No Return. But I always return, and I always hope to return. I hope to always return to that emerald green water, that particularly unique combination of flow, clarity, and sunlight that people call steelhead green. I hope to return to the bald eagle, the bighorn sheep, the white sand beaches down there that are replenished by the undammed high water spring flow. I hope to return to the rocks so old that they're beyond imagination, to the spruce and fir, ponderosa pine, the hackberry, mountain mahogany, cottonwood and alder, sagebrush and bunch grass, to the pictographs and petroglyphs, the ancient campsites that people walked on for at least 11,000 years. I hope to return. I will always return to walk in their tracks. I'll always return to the salmon, steelhead, and sturgeon. I'll always return to the winter ice, the summer high water, the fall steelhead run, and all that I love about that river. So thank you very much. So, got a few minutes. If you have questions, I'll try to answer them. If there's any discussion, I'll sit back and listen and learn. Yes?
You mentioned a lot of the impacts from damming.
Yes.
I was wondering what kind of impacts you noticed from recreational activities on the river?
From recreational activities, the predominant impact I see from recreational activities is on camps, is campsite activity. A lot of, at the end of the recreational float season, a lot of these campsites are beat down. There's soil compaction, there's vegetation damage, sometimes human waste and garbage are not carried out, but although I notice those impacts, believe me, they're way better than they used to be.
When did the lottery system?
The lottery system started in 1980. It's way better than it used to be, believe me. Yes?
Is there any potential for the Nez Perce or the Bannock or any of the other tribes along the river to protect for in-stream flow in any areas?
You know, the Nez Perce Indians had a very compelling legal argument against the state of Idaho to do just that same thing, and they settled it. They settled it by actually receiving a lot of money from the Bonneville Power Administration. So under current Idaho water law, as I said, in-stream flow is not a beneficial use, and these rivers are all way over appropriated. At the same time, the federal government, who at one time could have pushed federal primacy on the water rights in headwaters areas in order to protect flows like in that middle section, and they declined to do that. So I can't see Idaho water law changing. Perhaps it will. I sure hope it does, but I can't see it. I think, yes,
Sir, can you define what you mean by in-stream flow?
in-stream flow, that's currently all of the beneficial uses as defined by the state of Idaho involve removing water from the river. So when you have a water right for the beneficial use of agricultural irrigation or stock water, you must remove that water from the river. If you choose not to remove the water from the river, not to exercise your water right, it'll be taken from you and given to the next guy down the line. So that's in-stream use, yeah. Yes?
So the current logjam in Congress aside, most wild and scenic rivers have the problem of multiple jurisdiction agency management, where you've got National Park Service and Forest Service, or you've got BLM and National Forest, or you've got various problems like that. Where would you apply a legislative fix to get some sort of a unified management of a wild and scenic river? How would you draft a proposed solution?
For unified management, I would require the managing agencies in all those jurisdictions to formulate a river-wide, a river-long management plan and agree on the implementation of that instead of the fragmented management that we currently have.
Would that be something you do legislatively, or is that something you do?
That, I believe that would have to be done. Now, I'm certainly not an attorney. I believe that would have to be done legislatively to require a unified management plan. Yes. Do you know? Maybe Rick could tell me.
Well, I've got an opinion anyway. I think legislatively that generally there is a lead agency that's identified in each piece of legislation that creates a designation. But I think a more effective way is the agencies that administer wild and scenic rivers are keenly aware of this problem, and they work together, but each of them has different missions. The BLM's mission is different from Forest Service, different from Park Service, and so on down the line. So the best that the agencies have been able to do to date is to come together with an interagency council, policy council at the Washington, D.C. level to talk this out. And one of the main products that's been created is a website called rivers.gov, which is a really rich site where all the agencies work together as best they can to unify management of wild and scenic rivers.
Thank you very much. I have one back in the back. Yes.
Yeah, so you're talking about how all these agencies tend to be pretty fragmented. During the summer, I do restoration work with invasive species on the Salmon River. I know that there's a lot of under-table dealing that happens between these different administrative units where, like, if you take this section, we'll try to pick up the slack here. So a solution that a lot of these people on the ground seem to be having is just bypass the stuff and just go ahead and do it anyways.
Do you find that to be pretty successful in your experience?
It depends sometimes just on how well we're able to communicate. Like the Bitterroot Forest has some jurisdiction in the Salmon River, and it's really hard to communicate with them since they live all the way across the mountain range.
Right.
So it depends sometimes on things.
Okay, and in your invasive species work, is that primarily plants? Okay, all right, thank you very much. That's comforting to know that people are talking to each other and working around the obstacles. Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, the problem that you mentioned about the people, the managers not being there long enough to have a sense of place seems to permeate every single land management agency in this country. I live next to Glacier National Park, and I can't tell you how many park superintendents I've seen come through. They're never there long enough to love the place. And a lot of us feel like it's a conspiracy by the government to make it that way, so that they don't have, because a person that loves the place, that has a connection to the place, to the land, is going to be a problem if there's some development. He's going to be biased, and they consider that bias. And I have a lot of friends that are ex-rangers and ex-people that were lower down. On that level, they often stay in the area. They retire and live in Columbia Falls or Kalispell or Whitefish, and they love the park. But as far as the people up high that come and make the decision, the overriding decision, they're just bureaucrats that rotate through all these national parks.
Well, I noticed that to some extent on the national forest that I live in, the Payette National Forest. And another item that not to get sidetracked off this whole thing, but this consolidation of national forests, for example, the Salmon Chalice and the Nez Perce Clearwater over in Idaho, which are both along this river corridor. The Nez Perce Clearwater Forest is so huge and it's so diverse that there is just no way that one human being or even a committee of human beings can get their head wrapped around this whole thing. And I can't see how that's the most efficient management of the national forest. I mean, it might be efficient in terms of budget, but in terms of knowing the land and loving the land and having a sense of place, I don't see how one man or woman could do that with the consolidation of these huge management units. Yes?
What do you think are some approaches to restoring wild salmon populations or wild salmon habitat?
I think the two things that should be done is restoration of the migratory habitat. Remember, we've turned 400 miles of the Columbia and Snake River from free-flowing rivers to 8 back-to-back reservoirs with no current. Each reservoir impounded by a dam that was neither designed nor constructed nor operated today to safely pass juvenile fish. So we have a lethal migratory habitat for juvenile fish. The second thing we need to do is eliminate the hatchery program to eliminate unavoidable adverse impacts on wild fish. The hatchery program is not self-sustaining. It depends entirely on the genetics of wild fish. And, the process is killing the product. The hatcheries are killing the wild fish that ultimately the success of the hatchery depends on. So we could eliminate the fish hatcheries tomorrow. Restoring the migratory habitat would take a little longer. Federal dams, critical limiting factor to the survival and restoration of Snake River salmon and steelhead. Yes?
In your opinion, how can individuals here in this room, how can we propagate the desire for increased in wild and scenic river protections? What activities can folks in this room take home with them and promote? How can we help participate in our process of protecting our waters?
I think you've got a big opportunity here in the state of Montana. I think you're way more likely to add river miles and river segments in the state of Montana than you would be in my home state. You've got some great river organizations here. Yours, American Rivers. These folks, they know how to do it, and they know where to apply the pressure. And you know, politicians respond to pressure, and they respond to consistent pressure, consistently applied. So identification of the eligible rivers, looking at organizational help, because I don't think one person could do it on their own. However, the strength in numbers in organizations that are already on the ground here in Montana, I think there's some big opportunities to do it. It's already been done. You know, American Rivers out of Bozeman's had some pretty good success getting rivers designated here. Yes?
If I can just give a quick plug for that.
Please do.
In Montana, the Montanans for Healthy Rivers is a campaign that's being run by the American Rivers, American Whitewater, Greater Yellowstone Coalition, and the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. And we've got about 50 reaches of rivers statewide in Montana, and we're working with Senator John Tester to get a bill introduced. If you're interested, we've got a vibrant website. Go check it out, Montana's for Healthy Rivers, and join the campaign.
So I think, I don't want to keep you guys any longer because you've been a great audience, and I'll tell you what, there's a stunning killer moon out there right now. But thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I hope you go to the Salmon River if you haven't been there, and I'm sure if you have been there or after you go, it won't be the river of no return. I'm sure you'll go back.
Thank you.
Thank you.